More than half of all companies globally are family-owned or operated. Family businesses contribute 70% of the world's GDP and account for 65% of jobs. Their voices are important. Their stories must be told. Brought to you by the award-winning publication, Tharawat magazine. This is the Family Business Voice with your host, Ramya El-Agami.
The age of omnichannel marketing and its repercussions for family businesses. Technology fascinates Anders Sörman-Nilsson, a global futurist, speaker, and author of 3 books on the topic of digitization and innovation. As an innovation strategist, the Swedish-Australian consultant regularly advises some of the world's most well-known corporate brands. He also operates a strategic think tank called Think, which encourages organizations to improve their ability to anticipate change, apply cutting-edge intellectual tools, and decode the latest digital trends. Sörman-Nilsson's work builds a dialogue between past, present, and future. As a 4th-generation family business member, he is uniquely versed in the subject. We had the opportunity to sit down with Anders to discuss digital transformation in the family business, omnichannel marketing, and whether or not tradition and technological innovations are indeed antithetical. Enjoy this episode with Anders. Thank you very much for taking the time, Anders. And let's maybe start by you telling us a little bit more about, your background and also how and why you founded Think. And maybe you could also tell us a little bit more about your touching points with the family business subject, which you just elucidated before.
Okay. So I work as a futurist, and I've been doing so now for the last 13 years. As a futurist also, though, growing up in a family business context, I'm very much of a traditionalist. So I'm fascinated where I see the world, or the physical and the virtual, or the, as I call it, the analog and the digital, or tradition and technology, where they intersect and sometimes converge. And I guess the sort of initial inspirational spur to become a futurist was growing up and in some ways abreacting to growing up in a family business that was very, very analog, very old school. And my mum runs still now a 3rd-generation owner-operated menswear store in Stockholm, Sweden. The store was opened up by my great-grandfather in 1916. And it's one of Stockholm's most famous, and it's the oldest menswear store, and it's still eponymous these days with his name, Georg Sörman, or George Sorman, as we'd call it in English. And, the old neon sign is still, lighting up the Stockholm night sky during the dark months. So I grew up in a family business environment, and seeing my mother do exactly what her father did before her and his father did before him when it came to, everything from customer experience to managing inventory to how leadership gets done in the organization. And so in some ways, seeing the good, the bad, and the ugly of just continuing heritage, provenance, and ensuring tradition gets carried into the future, I could see both the benefits, but also the downsides to that, particularly in an era where, this moniker or this theme of digital disruption really impacted my mum's and my grandfather's business fortunes. And really at the turn of the millennium, seeing that, the movement towards both some demographic changes, but also technology-led consumer change led to e-commerce adoption, and certainly seeing, mum's fortunes and profits being drastically depleted. And then at the same time seeing that there wasn't a willingness to adapt with or adopt new mindsets. So I think in some ways, to answer you, and excuse me if I'm being very un-Swedish here and wearing my heart on my sleeve, I think in some ways my profession is in some ways probably an abreaction to some of my advice falling on deaf ears in a family business context.
I mean, Anders, I'm just going to also, I'm going to be very untraditional as well, in terms of how I sort of follow up on this question, because I would love to cut to the chase here exactly to what you just said. So you have this contrast between, the reluctance of adopting new practices in order to sort of benefit from a
more cyber-physical customer experience opportunity. And then you have another organization such as the bank in Australia that adopts it, and clearly you can show the success. I mean, today it's not really a matter of if, just rather of when and how, right? Like these practices are adopted. So why do you think there is this really stubborn sort of like a resistance still for so many businesses, and especially also family businesses, when it comes to this transformation? Like, what do you see are the most common factors that lead to this sort of the mindset getting very fixed and not being flexible enough to adopt these new, well, potential advantages?
So it's a combination of factors again. I mean, firstly, I'll start off and say that the rate of change has never been this fast and will never, ever be this slow ever again. And I think if we accept the sort of exponentiality of change, the way it's occurring right now, there's really no choice but to invest in the digital future. And the longer any family business waits, the more the likelihood is that they'll have to, as the expression goes, bet the farm. Mm-hmm. Which is not what we want to do. We want to make sure we invest in these things today, or even, preferably a few years ago, to make sure that we don't have to bet the farm or put it all on black, because that's a very, very risky behavior. So I think that's the sort of first idea here. The second one is that we also grow up in an environment here where digital tools and technology really come native to a generation, or particularly millennials or Gen Y, which are really the future of many family businesses as they're looking down the succession line at the moment, where really the millennial, and I'm guilty as charged, born in 1981, where we know a lot more about the enabling tools of business. And so beyond just the inherent friction in terms of succession, we know the 30, 13, 3% rule in terms of going from first generation, second generation, third generation successfully, and then hopefully creating the crown jewels of your business in the fourth generation and so on. The additional factor that your kids really have a grasp of these critical business tools in a way that the older generations, and I'm generalizing here, that they don't. That brings a lot of friction. And certainly in my experience, consulting with my mum's little shop, I'm just being the hobby psychologist here. But I think the fact that, I know a lot more about customer relationship management systems, inbound marketing, digital marketing, social media marketing, Instagram. I mean, all of these things would be highly frustrating when what my mum saw was that, you're a good apprentice under your father or under the previous generation for 30, 40 years until eventually you're handed the keys. And that's just no longer the case.
It's an interesting point you bring forward, but it's also could at the same time be construed as probably one of the greatest advantages family businesses have in facing digital transformation and opportunities also in digital marketing is actually that they by nature have a next generation joining the business, right? Which is something other businesses have to recruit, have to find. So technically, if the resistance weren't there, it's potentially something to leverage on for the family business, really.
And particularly in an era where we see heritage brands and provenance brands, some of which are, family-run businesses. I'm thinking of even in my mum's industry, in clothing, if you look at brands like, the British brand Barber, yes, guilty as charged, or, a Swedish brand like Eton, yes, I wear my mum's clothing, or, the Swiss brand Victorinox. I mean, these are all brands that have a beautiful history and stories that can, in a digital format, be told in an exceptional way, in a way that maybe their provenance and their heritage couldn't really be amplified and scaled, 20 or 30 years ago. Now we can take those stories of how, a Victorinox, knife helped save someone, or the Swiss knife helped, get someone out of trouble. And then they've really used those stories of how their clothing items or how their pieces of technology, helped save the day. And I think those opportunities can be moved from being dormant and latent to really helping to scale brands globally, courtesy of digital communications.
Absolutely. I mean, that's just like also the fringes of content marketing, a great opportunity for family businesses, no doubt. But also, I think we also see, though, that there's the other type of experience some family businesses have now. I mean, those that do adopt the methodologies, especially, for instance, in marketing, that go from an analog approach to what we would call a multi-channel approach. but haven't made the step to being omnichannel. So basically to having their channels also speak to each other in terms of like informing each other and creating a more cohesive experience between these channels. So where do we fall into the gap there, do you think, Anders? Like, where is that last effort, that last bit of effort, why is that not being made? Is it because there's no understanding? Is it because it is a very difficult part of the process? What do you think?
Well, if I look at even the changes between, publishing my second book, Digilog, How to Win the Digital Minds and the Analog Hearts of Tomorrow's Customers, which came out in 2013, and then publishing Seamless, A Hero's Journey of Digital Disruption, Adaptation and Human Transformation in 2017. Digilog was written at a time when, multi-channel in many ways was sort of emergent, and really we were just seeing the first snippets of omni-channel emerging. But then by the time of 2017, when Seamless came out, talking about this seamless integration between analog and physical channels, really we moved beyond this idea that you just had to add another channel. In the early days of social media, et cetera, it's like, Twitter is emergent, so make sure you set up a Twitter channel. Yeah. Instagram's the next thing in terms of, fashion bloggers. Facebook is now mainstream. But it was just about adding another channel. And the thing is, our customers don't think in terms of channels. They just want a coherent, omnipresent brand experience. Mm. And that's something that clients have to, that companies have to deliver. It's no longer a choice of, having a phone channel that doesn't speak to the digital booking system, that doesn't inform the salesperson on the floor that particular clients already try to solve a particular challenge via two medium before, and then having to ask all those questions when the person comes in store again. The customer just doesn't have any patience for that. And that's often what can happen in a multi-channel environment or in a very analog environment. Now all the channels have to speak to one another. And, that's something that increasingly we are seeing that brands are starting to do really well. But a lot of family businesses, given the some time resistant approach to new technologies, are lagging behind it.
Well, and it's interesting, though, because the inherent advantage of a family business is always actually the customer relationship, or at least it's termed as such, because we know that people actually like to buy from family-owned brands. So it's actually it's usually on average a big advantage to promote the fact that a company is family-owned. It gives people confidence, it gives them trust. So it's quite interesting that we should be lagging behind in some of these transitions.
I'm just going to add one thing there, and I think this is the fundamental sort of contradiction here. There's so many family-owned businesses who will claim that they're extremely customer-centric. Mm-hmm. But they're not very data-centric. Mm-hmm. In other words, is that you cannot claim to be a customer-centric brand if you're not extremely data-centric, mm-hmm. particularly if you want to scale your business. So yes, my mom, in the example of the little shop at Sörman in Sweden, she does know a lot of people that come into her store. In fact, she's gathering data, but it's only stored in her Filofax and in one folder, which is inside of her brain. So it's very hard to scale, or for her to even get her staff to have the same level of data science around their customer centricity. And she always says, hey, we're very customer centric. And I'm like, well, for example, if you're only using the analog method of connecting with people, if someone needs to return, an item of clothing or exchange it, for example, how empathetic with a customer is it to force them to get into the subway system in Sweden, go over icy streets to exchange? Or could you facilitate that in a more empathetic way, using the fact that they have a preference for doing digital returns with DHL or whatever it happens to be? And that digital solution is way more empathetic with the customer's needs, who may not want to go out on an icy street in Stockholm in winter.
And it allows to personalization touches, as you just mentioned, I think, as well, which is, of course, like one of the most important things to offer any customer experience today. But let's talk, I love that you make that transition to the customer centricity to data centricity as well, or data to being data driven, let's put it this way. But there is a dread of data, right? Like there is an actual dread of data, I feel like, and there's a lot of that In a family business, I don't know if it's the same in your experience with your clients, it almost seems like there's a worry that the data will contradict what people traditionally know about the business, and that it'll sort of like disrupt the culture. It will tell us things that we don't want to hear. So how do you go about it with your peers and with your clients and with the family businesses that you meet along the way at conferences? How do you sort of encourage them to face the facts that you might gather through big data coming from things like omnichannel marketing or other digital processes inside the company?
Well, there's a good saying that that to prove anything, like everybody is entitled to their own opinions, but nobody is entitled to their own facts. I mean, we're living in a data scientific world here where we can't just rely on gut feel or tradition or culture. And I think it was one of the management consultants, whether it was Peter Drucker or one of his associates, who said that when it comes to opinions and analysis, everybody has to bring data to show that this is accurate, and it's an accurate analysis. We only trust in God. Everybody else has to bring data. Now, whether you're religious or not, I think it's you get the ethos of this idea. And one example of this, for example, would be, in Mum's business, she always catered for some larger sizes in terms of her SKUs or her SKUs. So she catered both for quite tall gentlemen and as well as wider gentlemen. And this had always been a bit of a unique differentiating factor for her store. But when we looked at the turnover, looking at the data, it showed that these were the sizes that moved the least in her shop. Yet she thought of this as a core customer. And yet those items, as we know in retail, when they move slower, and also the material costs are higher because you're using more materials in terms of textile manufacturing, they also have a higher cost of procurement for her, and they move more slowly. This was super uncomfortable for my mum in terms of realizing this, but the data was blatant. And she has made some adjustments in terms of using now a digitized system that's helping her with procurement decisions. Now, she still hangs on to the fact that she needs to cater empathetically to this particular customer in some ways, but there's smarter ways of doing it. So I think, just to your point there, that the data can expose a lot of holy cows. But then you're still in family businesses, still sometimes culture eats strategy for breakfast. So even though you might have the most profound strategy of change, sometimes the inherent culture of a business can also kill or jeopardize the strategy as well.
I like that you just brought up, the culture can eat strategy for breakfast, but then also there seems to be this conviction that tradition and innovation are at odds with each other inside the family business context, which of course we actually know can't be true, because a family business couldn't possibly last 100 years if there wasn't continuous innovation, obviously, or of some sort, even if it's not very radical, but if there wasn't something that every generation brings to the table that the generation before didn't think of. So where do you think this prejudice comes from and especially when you think about in the marketing discipline as well, there seems to be this huge worry about loss of identity, or like losing something that we used to have. Like, so for instance, we know this 500-year-old jewelry brand from Europe, and 500 years of legacy, tons of stories to tell, beautiful marketing opportunity. And there is a real dread of losing the identity by using social media, which is just such an interesting thing, right? Because you'd think that, if anything, it'll just reach so many more people, right? Like, so where do you feel like this sort of like conviction comes from, that these things are at odds with each other, the tradition and the innovation that were being offered by these technologies?
Well, I think there's, firstly, there's always a fear that the digital world in some ways is sort of digitally dehumanizing. And certainly when your surname sits on the sign above the store or whatever it happens to be, the brand becomes an extension of yourself. So there's all of these, I guess, intermixing of your own sense of identity and the business. And then, a lot of inherent so-called wisdoms about, and I know even culturally in Sweden, we have a tall poppy syndrome, as we call it, or in Sweden we call it jantelagen, Jante, the law of Jante, which is that no one should, pop their heads up above anyone else or they'll get chopped down. So social media can be seen as narcissistic. And then you go, maybe we shouldn't beat the drum too much. Let's just keep singing in the shower and be subtle. And I'm sure this is true of other European nations and other parts of the world. And so all of a sudden, the fact that every brand now is a technology and a media brand that needs to provide great content, that actually is a bit scary, because before they were like, if you got acknowledged in the New York Times, that was a really nice thing, but it was not something you pushed for. Now if you can create your own content about, for example, how to do the perfect little, knot tie or a four-in-hand, or how to do the perfect little pocket square, that's content that people will consume gladly. But, it takes a little bit of, I guess, ego to stand and actually create content on your own, realizing that you're now a media company. So I think that's part of the hesitation, potentially, as it's seen as a little bit of narcissistic. But at the same time, I think it's more suspicious today if a brand cannot be found online, and if they haven't built digital trust, than if people are a little bit blowing their own trumpet, which I think we need to do in a world of digital noise. We need to establish some signal. And I think that analog signal in a world of digital noise is a unique opportunity for brands that truly have some skin on the nose and have history. They can do really well. And in fact, I think it can kind of be anchoring. And I'm all for startup activities as a futurist, but definitely I think there's something valuable and something enduring when family businesses truly tell their stories in a profound way.
It will always be the fourth generation of a family business. There's nothing that your futurist existence can change about that. That's for sure. But as the last question before I let you go to the airport, what you just said before, like I find it's so fascinating how quickly that reality has become part of our common sense, right? Like it's, as you said, basically, if I can't find a website about it, if I can't find a social media about it, site about it, at least millennials such as us, we would mistrust potentially the organization or even the person. We would expect some sort of minimal digital footprint to be there for us to prove the existence of whoever we're talking to or whoever we're buying from. Now, this has happened fairly quickly, if you think about it, right? Like maybe maximum of the last 10 years, this total shift in mentality has been there. What are the sort of like the biggest trends that you see in the omnichannel marketing area where you're like, okay, I'm excited about new technologies becoming part of the mix?
Wow, there's a variety, but I think oftentimes, particularly also in a family business context, there's a hesitation or a tendency to dismiss great customer experiences that happen in the digital world as just, that's a digital channel, as opposed to thinking about them as a deeply human, deeply empathetic, and very humane way of solving customer problems. So let me give you a couple of quick examples on this. We do a lot of work with insurance companies around the world. And some of our insurance clients previously have spent up to 50% of their contact center budgets answering which type of phone call? Status update phone calls. In other words, I filed my claim, where's my money? Mm-hmm. Right? There's probably a lot of paperwork before they even get to that point. Now, there's insurtech companies like Lemonade, for example, who now use the mobile interface. So you speak your claim into the mobile interface. Through facial recognition and biometrics, they authenticate. You run 21 different AI algorithms across your claim to test for fraud and set a world record between claim and payment, 3 seconds. Now, I feel like that's a way more customer empathetic, customer focused, and customer centric way of solving a problem. Mm-hmm. To take that a step further, if we use the blockchain, you asked me about technologies that I'm excited about, but they even predictively solve customer problems. Mm-hmm. Now, one of our clients is MetLife, and in Asia, they've launched a service called Vitana. So it's an insurance product offered to pregnant women in Singapore, where 20% of Singaporean women suffer from gestational diabetes during their pregnancy. So at the time they have their pregnancies confirmed, they get asked, would you like to take out this insurance? And if they register for the insurance, that gets annotated on the Singaporean e-health records. But then through an integration with the Singaporean e-health records and the insure chain, so the blockchain, Vitana or MetLife gets notified automatically if at the 20-week mark, if this particular lady is diagnosed with gestational diabetes, and the money gets paid out without any claim having to even be made. Now, that sort of predictive customer service is very futuristic. And I feel is very human and humane. Now, the last thing you want to do during a pregnancy is to have to fill in more paperwork and, stress out about, where the money's going to come from, et cetera, and validating the claim. So this is very human and very empathetic. And I think sometimes when family businesses go, oh, well, the best form of customer experience is just a smiling human interface, and it has to be from the person who has the surname that is the same one as on the door, they're wrong. Because these types of experiences set new, higher expectations amongst customers. And the technological solution, when it's designed correctly, can be even more loyalty building than anything we could offer via paperwork or a smiling human interface. So I think those types of examples are really, in a way, for my analog traditionalist soul, they're very heartening, because I do believe that, any brand, including family businesses, can code for more humanity by using technology. And that, if anything, will ensure their future, and the technology can help it live on.
Well, Anders, that was a perfect ending to your interview. It's perfect. Fantastic. I loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Family Business Voice. Subscribe to our channels now on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, or Spotify to be notified of our weekly episodes.